The Trump administration's slashing of public health funding, both international and domestic, puts us all at risk. Find out how cuts to aid in Central Africa can affect Middle America, and listen to the end for when to expect the next pandemic. Dr. Tyler Evans is an infectious disease and public health physician who currently serves as CEO and co-founder of Wellness and Equity Alliance. He's led major initiatives at Curative Incorporated, Marin County Health, and New York City's COVID-19 response. He oversaw the delivery of over 2 million vaccine doses nationwide and has deep expertise in HIV/AIDS, refugee health, and global infectious disease through work for Doctors Without Borders and the AIDS Healthcare Foundation. He's the author of Pandemics, Poverty, and Politics, Decoding the Social and Political Drivers of Pandemics from Plague to COVID-19, which explores how social and political forces shape the spread of disease. But first, a word from our sponsor. Hey, this is Brad Block, host of The Physician's Guide to Doctoring. This is a personal and professional development podcast for physicians where we have experts on the show that try to teach us everything we should have been learning while we were memorizing Krebs cycle.
Good to be back. We had a great conversation last time.
We did, and I'm looking to learn a lot more from you, especially with all that's been going on in the world. So let's get right into it. So the U.S. has withdrawn from the World Health Organization and slashed funding to programs like USAID and UNAIDS, really our most critical global health partnerships. In your book, you trace the social and political drivers behind past pandemics. So what historical precedents come to mind when you see a superpower pulling back from coordinated disease control like this?
Sure. So just to zoom out and discuss how the book is structured.
Please, yeah.
So the book's name is Pandemics, Poverty, and Politics, and it's decoding pandemics from the third cholera pandemic to COVID-19. And we're really looking at the social and political drivers. The first section talks about social medicine, why it's important, looking at the social drivers of healthcare, mostly chronic health. The second section focuses on essentially all of the pandemics, as I define pandemics, as mortality of more than 1 million people and crossing intercontinental lines. And so we started off with 1899 for a number of reasons. We felt like that was the most relevant, just looking at contemporaneous pandemics. And so we started with the cholera pandemic, the sixth pandemic, as well as the third plague pandemic, which roughly took place around the same time. And then we end with COVID-19. The third section is essentially, now that we have your attention and we identify the social and political drivers, what are we going to do about it? In terms of your question, that's really all section 2, which is looking at these precedents that we have. That was the genesis of me wanting to write the book, which I wrote over the course of 20 years. We don't learn from historical errors. We are not learning. In fact, we are going backwards. And we have a number of precedents that have taken place. In terms of what I define the socio-political determinants of pandemics, I create a rubric at the end of each of these pandemics that I described. And the rubrics go through, is there a socio-political link to the original spread of disease? Was there a lack of public and community health infrastructure at the time? Number 3, if yes, did the lack of infrastructure at the time of spread precipitate more widespread distribution? Number 4, was the lack of infrastructure at the time linked to a sociopolitical root cause? And number 5, is it treatable? In other words, would building more effective sociopolitical infrastructure mitigate the risk of spread? And essentially, then the reader is allowed to go through this questionnaire. We basically grade it if 60% or above. This passes the sort of the litmus test, but it's up to the reader to ultimately make that determination. We try to get to roughly around 100%, but again, it's up to the reader. Having said that, we have a number of pandemics. Particularly, I think the most compelling ones are probably the Hong Kong influenza and the Asian influenza that had taken place. And mostly it was because China at the time was not a part that, particularly during the Asian influenza pandemic, the WHO, newly formed, CDC was not really formed yet. It had its nascent experience there. And this was after the Bretton Woods and the United Nations coming together. It was a nascent organization, but it still existed. China did not engage, was not a part of the WHO. And so when these emerging outbreaks took place, they were not reporting this to any global surveillance sort of system. And so a lot of these pieces got lost. The Hong Kong influenza pandemic actually never even originated out of Hong Kong. It actually had originated outside of probably like Singapore or Vietnam. But there was some sort of confirmed reports. And so we'll never really get the clear picture of what had happened. And so our ability to really respond because it's not just China, obviously, that when we're dealing with a pandemic, by definition, we're dealing across country and according to my definition, across intercontinental alliance. This lack of public health infrastructure that China had dropped the ball on ultimately then impacted the rest of the world. So we're doing the same thing right now. The US is doing the same thing right now as obviously being a global superpower. And by decimating or disrupting these infrastructures, which not only surveil or track emerging infectious disease outbreaks, as well as then provide opportunities to respond, we're losing all of our population prevention programs that we've spent decades working on, as well as the synergistic connections across the world with the EU, CDC, our CDC, China, everybody calls it CDC. It's very rapidly getting disbanded, and it's very disheartening.
And that's where the whole America First comes in, is because they feel like they've been left behind, and we're spending all this money on infrastructure outside of the United States. And what they fail to realize is that does, in fact, help them and improve their quality of life and keep them safer. If we're trying to articulate that in a passing manner, we're not going to get up on the debate stage. We're not doing that. But we want to be able to communicate that to our community members, to our patients in a succinct way. How can we communicate the impact of what this administration is doing in terms of how it'll affect them?
Sure. I think the argument really just has to be framed in a way that understands how, to your point, how does it really impact me, right? Not my community, not my country, not globally. How does it impact me? Or let's even argue our immediate sort of community. And the reality is that whether or not we want to acknowledge or appreciate it or not, we are living in a highly integrated global system. And based upon economic trade, based upon migration patterns, we are at constant risk. If we do not identify these risks that are emerging at the local level, take Central Africa, for example, you take Uganda, you take parts of Sudan, Sierra Leone, where Ebola was emerging. Had we not been able to track that and respond to it in real time, had Ebola come into a city, because Ebola typically burns out pretty quickly because the case fatality rate is so high and it's so often symptomatic. And people just detect it at an early stage and we're able to then do something about it. If we take our foot off the gas or our hands off the wheel, we are just inviting all kinds of danger, safety issues into our country, because that person touches that person. There's an aid worker out there. They get on a flight. It's this very complex sort of epi network, and it ultimately lands in Des Moines, Iowa, or Chicago, Illinois, and it spreads there. And we saw that with SARS. We certainly saw that with COVID-19. And I think prior to COVID-19, it was hard for me to make the case to your typical suburban folks in the U.S. about why focusing on HIV efforts or TB efforts or malaria or whatnot is important. There's the philanthropic sort of argument, the charitable sort of argument, which makes people feel good. But the reality is, by investing in systems globally, not only are we protecting ourselves from immediate healthcare issues, but we're protecting global security, really, because the importance of a lot of foreign aid is soft power, right? Being able to invest in their health systems, being able to help them, provides an opportunity for us to engage and collaborate with these countries so that other actors, China, Russia, are not going to come in and ultimately then create relationships with them, which then further impacts or polarizes geopolitical issues. So there's that piece, which is incredibly important. And it's a heck of a lot cheaper to invest in that than to beef up military, which we're about to do with the current budgetary changes. From an infectious disease standpoint, we are allowing these microbes to basically pass without borders, without any sort of robust detection systems. And then again, they get into your local community. And what happens is it might be the folks, it might be the frontline workers, it might be people experiencing homelessness, it might be the poorest populations that are ultimately getting infected first because they're the most vulnerable. But at some point, there's going to be these concentric circles. And at some point, it's probably going to come pretty close to your home. And if it's not the infectious disease transmission that you are worried about, it is clogging up the health system so much, like we saw with COVID-19, where hospital capacity, ICU capacity was so saturated and exceeded that people could not come in. If your wife, your aunt, whatever is having an MI or something like that, they can't come in. And so that's why it impacts people economically, it impacts people from a global security standpoint, and it impacts your potential access to healthcare systems.
And not just while it's happening, right? We saw that with COVID-19, that it caused a lot of doctors that were on the brink to retire. So they're aging out. They're going to stick around for a couple more years in practice. Nope, now they're out. You've got a couple of people that they're financially independent. They don't need to practice anymore. They're out. So you see this mass exodus all at once of a workforce, and then that's going to impact people for a while. So there's so many, and it's really unbelievable that we lived through a pandemic. It was 5 years ago. It was 5 years ago.
Started 5 years ago, but ended a few years ago.
And we all lived through it. And not all of us, unfortunately, but now we're behaving as if it never happened. I think this is where the lab leak theory comes in. If they can blame it on an errant lab, then they can say it wouldn't happen again. Something like that wouldn't happen again because we wouldn't let it happen again, because we won't let that type of research be done. We can control that with our military might. Meanwhile, it was zoonotic in origin, no matter what their websites say. And we're great. Now we're going to invade more habitats. You spent years learning how to save lives, but no one taught you how to secure your own. When you work one-on-one with a CFP professional financial coach, you get a blueprint tailored for the long game of your complex situation. At My Financial Coach, they help physicians choose the best strategy to optimize your annuities and investments, implement tax-saving strategies, and tackle debt like your student loans or mortgage while refining your path to retirement. Save up for that boat, a child's college or wedding, or even a vacation home. Plan ahead for the impacts of the unexpected and understand how much life insurance you actually need. Project how getting married, raising children, or taking care of an aging parent affects the progress towards your goals. Advice-only financial planning through a fixed monthly subscription, not commissions, to keep planning unbiased and in your best interest. A financial plan isn't just about your money, it's about your future. Visit myfinancialcoach.com/physician's guide to doctoring to meet with a financial coach and find out if concierge financial planning is right for you. Again, myfinancialcoach.com/physician's guide to doctoring. So let's go into more detail about what exactly he's done. What are the specific cuts that the Trump administration has made that makes us more vulnerable to these infectious diseases?
So I want to get to that. I just want to respond briefly to two important points. One is when you were talking about the exodus of all these kind of public health professionals and docs, at one point I would go to the National Association of City County Health Officials annual conference for a number of reasons. And at one point, I believe it was 2023, and it was over 45% of public health positions were currently vacant at the time. That's half of all public health positions were vacant. I know in California, at least a third of our public health officers left because they were just done. They weren't well compensated. It was a lot of work and they were getting death threats or whatnot. So that happened during the prior administration, when we actually were still focusing some dollars into building up infrastructure. And then that sort of quickly receded. And I also, this is a pet peeve of mine, Brett, when people say during COVID, we're still in COVID, right? COVID has not left and it will not leave, right? We left the pandemic. COVID-19 will stay in perpetuity, endemically, sure. So getting to the next question, cuts. Before our talk here, I was just looking at the White House proposed budgetary cuts. And I think given the fact that it was approved the other day, I think most of these probably went through, but I'll just highlight some of the key ones that really impact basically foundations of population and public health prevention. One of them is global health. Okay, so that's over $6 billion. Now, there's a lot of concerns right now about PEPFAR. That's the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief. And I just need to give a little context to the importance of PEPFAR. PEPFAR is single-handedly probably the most important global health policy that has ever existed. And it was promoted, championed, and signed by George W. Bush. It's often identified that HIV has had bipartisan support and even more support from Republicans and conservatives. And so the fact that we are pulling back on that now is deeply concerning. PEPFAR's reduction in mortality has been just profound. Our response systems across the world, when COVID hit, when the pandemic hit in certain places where PEPFAR systems had existed, their surveillance and response was so fast because the sort of distribution sort of channels or networks were all set up. So to dismantle that would be devastating. This is during the prior administration, this had already been identified because there was some very tenuous and false sort of connection to abortion, which ultimately ended up becoming debunked. But PEPFAR has been on the chopping block for a while. And while they say they're going to retain certain parts of it, we're deeply concerned about where that's going to go. So that's global health, $6 billion in that. Strengthening institutions, $112 million. By definition, it is literally strengthening systems and our foundations in order to withstand cracks, any additional sort of cracks in the pavement or additional sort of emerging threats. The refugee or unaccompanied minor fund, that's close to $2 billion. That's being cut. We knew that was going to happen. Why that's so important? In refugee and unaccompanied minor programs, you've got big, substantial screening sort of modalities that are coming in that are partly through the CDC branch of refugee care, as well as working with essentially all the sort of UN branches or whatnot. And we still have to have some screening modalities of our own. And typically when refugees are screened in, CDC recommends within 30 days, but it's often extended up to 90 days, that we have these screening modalities looking mostly for infectious diseases. I've worked on a number of programs where I've integrated primary care and behavioral health or mental health components of that. But that's going to be a major sort of impact to us. HRSA at 1.7 billion right now. That is
HRSA?
Health Resources Services Administration. HRSA, why that's so important is because HRSA funds FQHCs, federally qualified health centers, the education programs across the country, the National Health Service Corps, the loan repayment program, which of course the administration is trying to break up, which incentivizes basically providers going into kind of low-income communities. And importantly, in kind of my world, it funds Ryan White. Now, Ryan White, most folks have forgotten that name, but Ryan White was important because he was a sort of formative figure that really demonstrated the transformative identity of HIV, that it wasn't just having a predilection for certain risk groups. In the beginning of the 80s, we used to identify them as the 4 H's. And those were homosexuals, heroin addicts, hemophiliacs, and Haitians. The Haitians was just basically a mistake in terms of epidemiological records. And it impacted their economy greatly. But the other 3 were not wrong in terms of risk groups, but it basically stigmatized them. And it gave the sort of it distributed the sort of misinformation that somehow only those 3 groups were the ones at risk. And in the beginning, HIV or AIDS was actually even called GRID, gay-related immunodeficiency disorder. That was under the Reagan administration. That was the official title because it was assumed that it was only gay men that were at risk. So Ryan White was a hemophiliac. I think he was 12 years old at the time. And he got infected with HIV because we didn't have any screening transfusion banks and whatnot. So he got infected. He ended up passing. But before, he did a lot of work with Elton John to really get the message out there that this disease is indiscriminate. It will impact everybody. And so Ryan White basically commemorated this boy's legacy. So the Ryan White Fund, I talked about PEPFAR globally. Ryan White is probably one of the single most important health policy pieces in the US in terms of public health. And it has provided funding for uninsured folks across the country. I often say that there's only 4 different groups that have guaranteed healthcare access in the country, and people living with HIV are one of them. Ryan White's signature health policy piece, super important, and made huge advances, and particularly focusing on what's called the 90-90-90 over the course of the last decade, and the HIV epidemic, which was a part of the 90-90-90 was 90% of people that are infected, we want them tested. 90% of those tested, we want them on treatment. 90% of those on treatment, we want them virally suppressed. And we're almost there, with the exception of certain populations. We call them key populations, like homeless, sex workers, like migrant communities, people of trans experience. And that's where my work is. And so the work in HRSA, particularly in the last 5 years or so under Laura Cheever, who I knew personally, went through great strides to identify the social drivers of HIV infection and really look at it from a syndemic standpoint, which means looking at a number of different epidemics and how they basically interact in a synergistic way, not in an additive way, in a multiplicative way, and how those are all influenced by not just behavioral health, but also by the social and political drivers. So I talk a lot about the syndemics in my book. And so HRSA really got it. And now the new administrator is essentially creating, I read some of this language here for you. He wrote this bulletin. This was April 7th. And in this bulletin, he said, and this is Thomas Engels and his healthcare experiences. He's an EMT, and now he's running Ryan White and HRSA. And so he says, but under the previous administration, certain interpretations of Ryan White allowable uses, as outlined in prior communications, co-opted the program's patient-centered mission in favor of radical ideological agendas and policies. Like, you just can't make this up. And then he goes on to say, he's referencing this bulletin that was sent in the prior year from Laura Cheever, saying any information on this page promoting gender ideology is extremely inaccurate and disconnected from the immutable biological reality that there are two sexes, male and female. The Trump administration rejects gender ideology and condemns the harms it causes to children by promoting their chemical and surgical mutilation, and to women by depriving them of their dignity, safety, well-being, and opportunities. This page does not reflect biological reality, and therefore the administration and this department rejects it. I try to depoliticize public health, but this is the handmaid's tale. All the scientists and public health professionals that have put their entire careers into this space, including myself, are now, all this progress that we had is now being attacked as radical ideology, when so much of it is so rich in data and so evidence-based. That's where we're at. And they're cutting, in terms of the cuts, they're cutting 1.7 billion. CDC, 3.6 billion. NIH, CMS actually did not get cut as much as we thought, 674 million, or that's what they were proposing. So all these systems connect. All these systems are basically our foundations of science, research. It all intersects and allows us to be smarter. And we're just going backwards as a result.
Right. And they claim to be protecting women from trans people. And in reality, the biggest threat to pregnant women are men, right? Domestic violence is a major cause of mortality, if not the top cause of mortality in pregnant women. And yet we're not doing anything about gun safety and gun violence. The hypocrisy is just remarkable. And now we're talking about this big, beautiful bill that they're talking about and all the cuts to Medicaid. And you talk about all of these ways that cuts internationally can affect us, right? They make the world less safe. They make the world less safe. They make us less safe because we are part of that world. We can't cut ourselves out from it as much as the America First people want to. But we're also cutting things back home, right? As you talked about with the Ryan White program, and we're cutting Medicaid. And you've outlined in your book how poverty and neglect create this fertile ground for the spread of disease. And yet income disparity, cuts to Medicaid, all of these things are creating poverty and neglect now back home as well.
Yep.
So it's creating even more fertile ground for the spread of disease.
Yep.
And denying science. They're cutting vaccines. They're not going to be allowing COVID-19 vaccines. So now that it's endemic, part of which is because of the incredible vaccines that were created, and now we're not even going to be offering it to people.
Yep. They'll study the risk of environmental or vaccines on autism.
Someone should look into that. God forbid they read what's already been done. So I just want to talk a little more about the risks back home. And just what you talk about in the book is the historical context by which we're repeating ourselves. And I think we talk about how advanced we are as a civilization, and ultimately that's technology and science, because technology and science builds on what was learned before. But apparently history does not do that, because we're seeing it again and again. So with the cuts to Medicaid, with the increased income disparities, cuts to these HIV/AIDS programs, right? And also cuts to mental health, right? There are cuts to Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration as well. The doublespeak, right? They talk about how we don't have a gun problem, we have a mental health problem. And yet they're cutting the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Service Administration. What I'm getting at is, should the headlines be true, right? Because we don't know the extent to which they're going to be controlling the narrative. But if they were true headlines, with regards to historical context, what are you expecting to read in the headlines in the next coming months to year? To take out your crystal ball based on what you've seen in the past.
Oh, we're going to be, let me just flag a few things because they were important that you just said. So you talked about SAMHSA, Substance Abuse Mental Health Service Administration, and the cuts to that. As an infectious disease specialist, I actually spend more time focusing on mental health and addiction. And the reason why that is, again, is getting back to that syndemic model that is heavily influenced by both. And so as an HIV or an ID doc, I can't tell in the exam room, I'm not going to spend a lot of time, somebody who's injecting drugs take your pick, meth, fentanyl. And with decompensated mental health issues, I'm not going to spend a lot of time trying to convince this person to take their HIV meds. Now, the good news is we have new long-acting injectables, which is going to be a game changer, has been a game changer for many of our folks, and we're studying it, where adherence is not as important. But the reality is, if we don't address those core issues, those mental health and substance use issues, that's where the syndemic piece comes to play, right? It ultimately increases the risk of infectious diseases. And right now there's a hepatitis A outbreak taking place in LA County. It's not going to just be in the homeless encampments, it will spread. That's what infectious diseases do. We will see more of that. My point is, by taking our hands off the wheel of mental health, substance use, which what we're doing, which I was quite surprised at because I thought Vance and Trump were behind mental health and addiction medicine, and partly because they have lived experience. But I really thought that we would see more promotion, but I was wrong with that. And I think in today's
a common thread is natural selection. They're trying to make the most vulnerable among us even more vulnerable. And it seems to be the common thread, right?
Yeah.
That's the only thing that makes sense.
Yeah. So in terms of what are the headlines, it's the next pandemic. It's the next pandemic, and we will rewrite history. And just to demonstrate history again of the last 125 years, we got the third plague pandemic, 1855, 1960, sixth cholera pandemic, 1899, 1923, Spanish influenza, very famous 1918 Spanish influenza, actually did not have its origin in Spain. I think many people know that took place here in Louisiana. Asian flu, 1957, Hong Kong flu, 68, 70, swine flu, 2009, 2010, HIV, 1981, and ongoing, Ebola, number of outbreaks, and now we're at COVID. And then there's the most prevalent infectious disease killers, not pandemics, but the ones that oscillate between endemicity and epidemics, which are TB, malaria, meningitis, measles, diarrheal diseases. Again, the book kind of identifies how almost all of them have socio-political links or drivers. There's a common thread through all of these. If we don't take lessons from history and apply them to the future space, which we are absolutely not doing right now, given the risk of this multipolar world and all of the cascading impacts of technology, further travel and integration and environmental concerns, it's a ticking time bomb. And it's just a matter of time. I would not be surprised that if we're going to have another epidemic in the next 5 years. It'll probably be another respiratory disease. And it will spread again, even quicker, probably this time, given the fact that we have taken our foot off the gas or the hands off the wheel. And then I don't know, Brad. I don't know if that will, if COVID didn't wake us up.
Yeah, if COVID didn't teach us, how is this going to teach us, right? We're just going to keep not learning the same lessons.
So I think the important message, the message of this book, the reason why I wrote it, and the messages that I'm trying to have on spaces like yours is to get to, this is typically the docs and healthcare professionals, but I want to get into the living rooms of your Joe the plumbers and whatnot, your average folks, and really just explain to them how this does impact them and how ultimately, and it's not a complex sort of nonlinear sort of equation here. There's a very clear linear sort of chain of events. We saw it less than 5 years ago. It's going to happen again. And it's going to impact your Aunt Ida as well as folks in Botswana and Sierra Leone or whatnot. And that's just reality because we are all connected in this sort of integrated global system.
I don't want to end on something dark because this whole interview has been that, right? I want to end on something positive and uplifting if we can possibly do that. So amongst all of this, what gives you hope? Like you do all this amazing work and you've dedicated your life to giving back and making the lives of less fortunate people better. So you are giving me hope, right? By the fact that you are out there communicating this information, fighting the good fight, right? But what brings you hope?
Good question. I am an eternal optimist. And despite the fact on certain days I may wake up with somewhat cynical view, I'm constantly impressed by the power of humanity to band together and work together and address challenges together. And what I find so distasteful is when you have these populist leaders who come in and sow fear and discord or whatnot to basically break up that solidarity among humans that effective leaders should essentially bring together. And I saw that during the pandemic. I've seen that during HIV, people working across the aisle to get things done and to help humanity. And that to me is really reaffirming. I think that we can get through a lot of this if we just depoliticize this stuff and focus on, and I'm not talking about all the dimensions of this world because that's way beyond me, right? I'm really just talking in my space, public health and healthcare. That's the control that I have. And if we can explain again how focusing on building out systems of public health, which by definition is for the common good, and connect that to healthcare in a more integrated fashion so that certain sort of communities would not fall through the cracks, which then impacts themselves. If we can get that message across, I believe that most folks that I talk to, whether red states, blue states, whatnot, ultimately want the same thing. And they want their communities to be healthy. They want their families to be healthy. And ultimately, they want to thrive. And we have to stop demonizing certain groups, migrants, homeless, et cetera. That's what this divisive politics has just gone in a just radically unhealthy direction. And it's created just so much more polarization. It just doesn't need to be there. While I cannot convince the United States to all get behind immigration and homelessness, that's never going to happen. But what I can do is try to explain how these pieces, if we don't address them, if these populations, if we don't address them and provide them with primary care, population prevention, and public health efforts, then they will be impacted and their communities will be disrupted. And again, I have seen it. I have seen the responses. I have looked into a number of people's eyes and I see that spark. Before I meet them, I hear their politics, right? Because social media has emboldened us to be different people than we actually are. But if you come out of that and you just talk, I find that most people, we can connect on a certain level. And I can typically find, not all the time, public health and healthcare to embolden them. And so that's what keeps me going.
I think the messaging, and just to get a little political here, I think the messaging needs to change on the left. Because on the right, their message is, this is how we're going to help you. This is how we're going to look out for you. And the messaging on the left is, this is why you should look out for other people who are less fortunate than you.
Yep.
And the message needs to be, here's how protecting these vulnerable populations helps you. You can feel good about helping. But at the same time, and that's what you talk about, right? This is what you've been talking about the whole time. How we are all interconnected, syndemic, right? This is, you can't pull yourself away from these situations because it will spill over into your front door and into your house. And so we have to start speaking in a way that says, this is how this helps you. Do it out of goodwill, right? No, we have to speak in ways that this is how it's going to help you. And if we don't start doing that, then they're going to keep voting out of fear for someone like they have.
I totally agree. I think, and when I do talk to certain folks in certain states who probably have very different politics than I gauge with that, see where they're at. And that's what I'll often talk about. I'll often talk about, it's the rational common sense argument. This will impact you. And importantly too, not just health, but economy as well. It will protect your bottom line to basically invest in these systems. And typically
it does well financially. That's what the financial markets want. They want stability and predictability. And when we take that away with pandemics and poverty and instability because of the consequences of that poverty, then look what happens to your 401k.
Yep. And I agree with you. I think on the left, there's been too much radical ideology. There's been too much promotion of these ideas that are just too abstract and disconnected from a lot of folks, right? Like most folks want to just basically pay their bills, come home, have a stable life, have their health insurance, have their access to their doctors, their providers, whatnot. They don't care about what's happening in Ukraine or Gaza or whatnot. That's just not their thing. And I thought deeply about this. And I think when it came to the polls of the last election, we need to just hear where folks are at and stop. The message needs to be reshaped, right? Like we need to your point, we need to explain to people if A, let's educate you on some of these health policies and educational policies and whatnot. And B, we're going to explain to you why this matters to you, right? Why this matters to you in this community and what do you get out of it, right? That's the piece that we need to do a lot better at, is explaining what you get out of this piece. So that's my goal. That's my mission.
I love it. If you want to hear more, definitely check out his book, Pandemics, Poverty, and Politics, Decoding the Social and Political Drivers of Pandemics from Plague to COVID-19. Dr. Tyler Evans, thank you so much for your time today and all that you do for the world.
Thanks, Brad. Great to be here. Thanks, Brad. Great to be here. Thanks, Brad. Great to be here. Thanks, Brad. Great to be here.
Thanks for listening. I have a favor to ask. You listened to the episode until the end, which means you either fell asleep or you really liked the episode. So please share it, or like it, or comment on a social media post, or write us a 5-star review. Something. It would really help me out. And maybe what you learned from this episode can help someone else too. The views expressed in this episode are those of the interviewer and interviewee and don't represent the views of their employer or even their significant other. Even though the magic of podcasting make it sound like I'm talking directly to you. This is not a doctor-patient relationship, and this is not medical advice, or financial advice, or really any advice. Thank us again for listening to The Physician's Guide to Doctoring.